Hello and welcome to this episode of Shatterdice Reviews, and today's board game review is
Resident Evil 2, the board game. This is the first episode in my review of the Resident Evil board game series by Steam Forged Games. We will be looking at this series in release order, which means the first game we will look at is Resident Evil 2, the board game, then Resident Evil 3, and finally Resident Evil, the board game. While this might be the most counterintuitive game numbering system in the history of numbers, the reason for this is because each board game is based on its respective video game, and I can only assume they started with Resident Evil 2 because it is the most popular of the video games. So with that said, we are going to take a look and see what it's all about. Resident Evil 2 is a dungeon crawler game for 1 to 4 players, in which you will take on the role of one of the survivors from the Resident Evil 2 video game and play through a campaign that attempts to retell the story of that game. If you're a fan of Resident Evil 2, you will recognise all your favourites: Claire Redfield, Leon S. Kennedy, Ada Wong, Robert Kendo. Robert Kendo, really? The guy who gets eaten less than 5 minutes into the game? Okay, well, I guess we needed someone to make up the numbers. It's not like Resident Evil 2 has a massive cast of heroes. Now here is something else fun for hardcore fans of Resident Evil 2. The maps you will be exploring in this game are preset and designed to heavily resemble the layout of maps found in the video game, which really does a lot to give that feeling of playing through the original video game. The tiles themselves are quite small in size, such as this one you can see here, being a corridor that is only one space in width. This really adds to the claustrophobic atmosphere and makes avoiding those zombies and monsters even more difficult. While you explore these maps, you will be collecting items and avoiding the shambling undead zombies that roam the Raccoon City Police Department, where the bulk of the game takes place. In each scenario, you will usually have a different objective that involves finding a specific item and reaching a specific location to end the scenario. Sometimes a scenario will end with a boss fight, but most of the time, boss fights are their own individual scenarios. Boss battles are a little more involved than regular combat, as each boss in the game has its own unique behavioural deck that will attack you in different ways that reflect their video game counterpart. All the time you're playing this game, exploring and struggling to survive, this is ticking away in the background: the tension deck. The tension deck is the game's timer mechanic and is constructed in a specific way for each scenario, outlined in the campaign book. More on the tension deck later. First, let's take a look at the basic components. The scenario brief will instruct you on how to set up the map tiles and search tokens, in addition to any other specialist tokens such as typewriters, item boxes, and corpse markers, and, most importantly, doors. Search tokens are divided into 2 types, each marked with the letter A or B, as you can see here. The A and B search tokens correspond to the search decks, also A and B. These 2 search decks are constructed at the start of the scenario as detailed in the briefing, so you will have some idea of what is in each deck and where the most important or useful items are. Most items in the game are weapons, ammunition, healing items, and keys. Item box tokens are an important aspect of the game, as each character in Resident Evil 2 can only carry a limited number of item cards. The item box token allows you to store items for later use and carries between scenarios in the campaign, so it's always worth stashing some health and ammo for the more difficult games towards the back end of the campaign. Typewriter tokens can be used to reshuffle the tension deck, essentially allowing you to reset the game timer. This will become clear when we cover the tension deck in more detail. Lastly, we come to door tokens. Doors are extremely important in this game, and are probably its most unique and key mechanic, as they are essential to how enemies function, as well as being one of your main obstacles, as the objective of a scenario is often to find a key and get through a locked door. So how do these doors affect enemies? Well, that brings us to Resident Evil 2's enemy mechanics. Unlike many board games, enemies in Resident Evil 2 do not have their own fixed turn. Instead, they perform reactions. On your turn, if you perform an attack action, the monsters will hear you and react, usually performing a movement towards the character making the attack. However, they will only do this if they have an unobstructed path to the character. In other words, they must be on the same tile or a linked tile. A linked tile simply means the doors between your character and the enemy are opened, as you can see here. If the doors are open like this, you essentially treat all these tiles as the same tile. If the door is closed, the enemies on the other side don't react. This means closing the doors behind you like a polite guest is the safest way to get through the map and stop enemies moving. However, it is worth knowing that if there is a valid route, no matter how long that route is, enemies will attempt to get to you. This means you can employ some tactical play on larger maps, opening and closing specific doors to cause enemies to move in the direction you want them to can be the difference between success and failure. So finally, we get to the basics of a turn for your character. Well, the basic turn is quite simple. Each character receives 4 actions on their turn, which will be mostly moving and searching. The actions available are move, search, attack, opening and closing doors, and interacting with any specific tokens such as typewriters and item boxes. The attack action, unlike many dungeon crawlers, is somewhat of a desperate act in Resident Evil, as firstly, hitting the target can be very hard with some of the more basic weapons. These blue dice have dodge symbols on 3 of the faces which do nothing during attack, and these 2 different types of hit symbols correspond to an effect on the weapon card you are using. As you can see here, the basic pistol only deals damage when you roll this symbol, which means a 1 in 6 chance of dealing damage. When you roll this other symbol, of which there are 2 on the blue dice, you push an enemy. So you have a 1 in 6 chance of dealing damage and a 2 in 6 chance of pushing an enemy, which does no damage. In addition to this low chance of causing damage, you also have these ammunition dials, which track how many bullets you have left. No bullets, no attack. So you want to make sure you save as many of these as possible for when you really need it. You can find ammunition by searching the area, but this takes up valuable time and actions. But if you are trying to avoid a fight, and these map tiles are so claustrophobic, just what are you supposed to do? Well, it's simple. You run. The game is more about avoiding enemies than fighting them, and this is handled with those blue dice I mentioned earlier. Remember those dodge symbols? This is where you use them. Whenever an enemy is in the same space as your character, and you perform any action other than an attack, you must first attempt to dodge the enemy. Each character has a dodge attribute on their character card, which tells you how many blue dice they roll when dodging. As you will see, these dodge symbols are each slightly different, and the symbol you need to roll depends on the size and number of enemies in your space. The more enemies in your space, the harder they are to dodge. If you roll a success when dodging, you get to complete your action. But if you fail to dodge, then that action is cancelled. The exception to this is the attack action. You don't need to dodge to do it, but if you fail to hit your target, then an enemy in your space will automatically hit you, and regardless of whether you hit or not, all enemies on linked tiles will perform a reaction. After you have spent your 4 actions, the enemies perform a reaction step, where each enemy performs 1 reaction. And then you move on to the tension phase. The tension phase is very simple. Draw a card from the tension deck and resolve the text printed on it. These come in 3 colours. Green cards are usually safe, amber cards are bad events, and red cards are horrible events, usually causing direct damage or spawning enemies. So the tension deck is not simply a timer, it is also a kind of event deck that keeps players on their toes and the gameplay suitably, well, tense. That's about it for the core gameplay. Really, you will spend your time running around trying to avoid fights and snatching up all the items you can carry. Now for a quick note on the expansion content. There is quite a lot of it, from the B files that adds additional scenarios to the campaign to the 4th survivor that lets you play a solo challenge mode as an Umbrella Special Forces operative. Some introduce new monsters and new survivors, really enriching the experience. But what I really like is the PvP it brings to the table. In PvP mode, up to 4 players take on the role of survivors, and 1 player takes on the role of one of the villains from the video game. Both sides will have separate goals that come into conflict with each other. All the while, zombies and monsters will attack any of the players they can get their teeth into. While there aren't many PvP scenarios, they do bring a different way of playing to the table, which I always appreciate. It also extends the replayability outside of the campaign due to the competitive nature of PvP. Well, that's it for gameplay talk. Let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good. If you're a fan of zombie games with a bit of a bite, Resident Evil 2 does a lot of things right. The reaction system is great and keeps enemy activations quite short, allowing you to get on with playing your turn rather than the enemy's turn. Closing and opening doors is also a great mechanic that really makes you think ahead and plan out a good strategy to get across the map as safely as possible. Perhaps my favourite part of this game is the balance of combat and resource management. It really makes you weigh up your choices as to whether you spend that bullet or risk a bite. It truly brings out the tension and perfectly replicates the feel of the Resident Evil 2 video game, which I have always been a massive fan of. The bad. I don't have too much bad to say about the game. What it offers as a game it does well. However, the one place it really falls down is its story. If you have played the video game, you will have no problem understanding where you are in the story. But if you haven't, then you are going to be at a loss as to what is going on. Each scenario has a short piece of narrative text to set the scene, but they don't really follow on from each other or explain why you are doing the things you are doing. It's a little immersion breaking and makes the story very weak if you are not already familiar with it. I suppose the setup can be quite fiddly too from a gameplay standpoint. Making sure you have the right items and tension cards can take a little while to sort out, and there are a lot of tokens and doors to put on the board that you need to make sure are in the right spaces. But that's about it for the bad. The ugly. There is only one thing that truly stands out as ugly here: the map tiles. In the first print of the game, these map tiles were so dark they may as well have been black cardboard with white and red lines printed on them. They were so bad that Steamforged Games released a pack of map tiles with lightened colours to replace them, and in all future printings of the game, these new map tiles are included. I bought the tile pack as I just couldn't bear playing the game in this black void of cardboard, but honestly, even these brightened tiles aren't that great. A lot of them are reprints of other tiles, and a lot of the memorable and outstanding locations of the video game aren't represented here, leading to many of the scenario maps lacking any real character or individuality. Just another series of hallways and offices, even in the sewers apparently. Overall, I really enjoyed Resident Evil 2 the board game. It's got a lot of heart, and it's clearly made with the passion of people who love the video game. And if you're a fan of the Resident Evil 2 video game, love zombie board games, and perhaps want a break from Zombicide, this might just be the game for you. I have to say, when it comes to boring games, Resident Evil 2 is certainly not boring.
Well, I'm bored of reviewing this game now. Bye.